Hi, I'm Ilene Katz, and I am here today with Joel Klein, the Chancellor of the New York Schools. Welcome, Joel.
Thank you. Nice to be with you, Ilene.
Thank you. Today, I'd like to get your views to start out with on the Supreme Court. You clerked for Justice Powell, I believe, and were a very successful Supreme Court litigator, I think winning 9 out of 11 cases. Really an incredible record. Afterwards, you're in the White House. You helped Ruth Bader Ginsburg to prepare for her hearings. And now we're about to have another nominee. What advice would you give to President Obama in his selection?
Well, first of all, the names that are now out there, the three who seem to be at the top of the list, Elena Kagan, Merrick Garland, and Diane Woods are all people I know well and worked with at various times. Diane at the Antitrust Division. And any one of them, I think, would be a superb Supreme Court Justice. I think they really are all very distinguished. Having said that, you pointed out I clerked for Justice Powell, and I've always thought that in more recent years the court has become too homogeneous in terms of the background of the justices. And when I worked for President Clinton as his deputy counsel, I worked both on the Ruth Bader Ginsburg nomination and the Stephen Breyer nomination, two distinguished justices. But we looked hard for people outside of the Court of Appeals ranks and outside of the traditional legal ranks. I mean, so many great justices, whether they were people like Hugo Black or Earl Warren, came from different pathways, and of course Lewis Powell. So if the president could find somebody that had the right mix of things, I would certainly, if I were advising him, tell him to look hard there. But at least the people that are on his short list, as been reported, any one of them would be a great justice.
Do you think it'll make a difference on antitrust jurisprudence, who he picks?
I would be surprised. As you know, court tends to be divided these days into a, if you will, conservative and a more liberal block. And certainly John Paul Stevens, who's now retiring, was a part of a four-person, more traditional liberal bloc, and I think his replacement will probably vote similarly to the way he would vote on many issues, including antitrust. But I don't think you'll see that change in the balance. Now, if you were to bring on somebody who is really a scholar in antitrust, who might have influence, but as you and I know, the first thing presidents look for is not usually your antitrust credentials. So
That's
it's
true.
Unlikely that that's where he'll be searching. But of course, Diane, interestingly, I mean, Diane really does have a strong background in that field, and she might have, by dint of experience, knowledge, depth of understanding, might have some influence on other members of the court. And, you know, most of these cases, they're oftentimes marginal. Put it this way. They're either easy, in which case they're a 9-0, 8-1 case, or they're hard and they're 5-4. And in the course of 5-4, one person can have an impact.
But it might not be in the antitrust area that you have that sort of divide.
You might not, although you could as well in antitrust. I mean, you know, some of these cases tend to be somewhat polarized, but it's true that you'd expect that much more in campaign finance, civil rights, the abortion, the hot button issues.
First Amendment sort of
First
issue.
Amendment, exactly.
Exactly, much more sexy topics than antitrust for some people.
Well, as a former antitrust enforcer, I don't like to acknowledge that antitrust is not a sexy topic.
That's what I wanted to hear.
Good.
Well, I love preparing for interviews, and it gives you a chance to go back and reflect. Found it interesting because of the debate we've had with healthcare exemptions. As you probably are aware, Christine Varney testified about the possibility of cutting back on McCarran-Ferguson. And I noted with interest that, surprisingly, Tom Campbell, during your reign at the Justice Department, tried to have an exemption for, I believe it was physicians and HMOs. I was wondering whether, since you've now been involved in more of a business setting as the Chancellor, whether you still have the same views toward exemptions.
I'm not big on antitrust exemptions. I think that by and large, when we try to do what we've tried to do in healthcare, which is to create regulated markets, and in this instance, highly regulated 50 jurisdiction markets, I think what it leads toward is higher prices typically, more requirements, more bureaucracy, less efficiency. So it doesn't come as a surprise, and in fact, as we'll discuss, even in my views about the schools, it doesn't come as a surprise that I generally think the best set of outcomes are produced in markets. Now, you want to regulate against abuse in a market, and some of the issues that the president, for example, has been discussing, which makes sense to me. But you don't want to exempt and think you can regulate your way across a broad market. Healthcare in America today is what, 17-18% of our GDP.
Mm-hmm.
Just having breakfast with some officials from Australia, and I asked them, Australia, which has a good healthcare system, spends 9% of its GDP. So we're talking about twice that. And I think the regulatory dimensions of it are much less likely to get us to the right mixes. So I would certainly be in favor of more robust antitrust enforcement in that field. However, you don't want to superimpose it on this highly regulated. Then you'll get, I think, chaos. So it would take a combination of deregulation and traditional antitrust enforcement. And certainly the kind of thing that Congressman Campbell was talking about exempting the physicians and all of that. I never had any interest in that. Yeah.
No, and it makes sense to me. And when you look at it, we also have problems when there's these externalities. Everyone always wants everything, especially if you're not paying for it. Something you probably have heard as Chancellor in your dealings.
In government, it's the same thing. Of course, you don't pay for it; the citizens pay for it. I had a friend. We were talking about appellate judge before, Doug Ginsburg, who I clerked with, and he always used to say he'd never agree to share the price of a meal because everybody spent more that way. So it's the classic externality. If you share the cost, other people are more interested in maximizing their portion, and I think that's a big part of healthcare. I think that we have kind of figured out how to expand coverage, but I don't think we've really figured out how to tackle cost. And I don't think it's viable to continue to escalate the portion of our overall GDP for healthcare. And so while obviously comprehensive coverage matters and irrational exclusions should be eliminated, if we don't figure out some form of competitive model and some way to really readjust how much we spend as a nation on healthcare, we're going to pay a huge competitive price. People used to talk about the cost of a U.S. automobile and what the health insurance put in the cost of that versus the cost of a Japanese automobile. And it's big, big differences, and we need to address that in terms of our competitive viability.
Especially as our generation gets older and we're retiring, and it becomes a bigger portion of the pensions. And pensions are a big issue for the school system for you.
Enormous issues, because pension takes money out of our current operating budget as our pension exposure grows. And, it's like people, I love this about government, people say, well, that's pension, it's not part of the operating budget. And, I say, well, if you spend it on one, you can't spend it on the other. And, again, this is, I think, the public sector is the last sector that has defined benefit pension plans, but I think that's short-lived. I mean, we saw what happened in Detroit. In many ways, if you look at what happened in Detroit, it's not dissimilar to what's going on in large public sectors like education, where we've got a lot of misalignment of incentives back paying people after they leave the system with massive amounts. I mean, you can retire in New York City now easily $70,000, $75,000, $80,000 at age 55 for the rest of your life. And that's going to take a lot of oxygen out of the system. It also creates perverse incentives for employees, because after you're there for a decade, it's very hard to leave, because you got this pension lock-in. Whereas if you had a portable or pension, a defined contribution pension, there's no impediment to the free flow of human capital, which I think, generally speaking, is not only good for the school system, but good for the economy.
Right, and that's perhaps why we see New York State and other states struggling as well, because it's a microcosm when you look at the city schools versus all the other, as you said, public sector jobs, whether it's police or whatever it might be.
It's absolutely the case. I mean, it's not just New York, it's New Jersey, our neighboring state, California, and they all have got large, a recent study came out, they had large unfunded pension liabilities. I had a laugh. They said the state of New York, they estimated, had about a 25% gap, which they thought was incredibly low. But
Sounds large to me.
Well, it's not compared to a 50%
right, exactly,
gap, but it's really astonishing. So I think that's the whole set of issues about how we compensate public officials, public employees, the mix of benefits and wages. The theory used to be the wages would be low, the benefits would be good. That seems to me to really misalign the way you want to think about these things.
It's very clear that your time as a competition lawyer has spilled over into how you think in your current job.
Very, very clear indeed. I think that one of the big problems is public education is a competition-based service delivery system. And the other problem is it's a system without accountability. And so if you don't have the market forces, so to speak, to engender accountability, then you certainly need rigorous regulatory accountability system. Public education has little of either. And so to me, core competition policy issues are things that are very important. And I've pushed those. I mean, I'm sort of known for a pro-consumer choice, meaning pro-student and family choice. I've opened up with the mayor lots of charter schools in New York, all of which are choice. Nobody has to go there. But they create an alternative, particularly in high-poverty neighborhoods, for children who wouldn't have choice otherwise. I mean, the people who are watching this, the people in the ABA, their kids will have choice. They'll either go to a private school, they can go to a public school if they like it. If they don't like the public school near their home, they can move, etc. But kids in high-poverty neighborhoods don't have that degree of consumer choice in antitrust terms, but of kid choice in school terms. And as a result of that, you often get the kind of practices that we associate with monopolistic providers. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is bring real competitive pressure and let the parents choose. And as a result of that, no school can take the kids for granted. You've actually got to earn the kids. And that's probably, in our terms, much more of a consumer than a provider focus. And I think it makes great sense. And, you know, but I will tell you, at the antitrust meeting, people will say, sure, we get that. I mean, competition, I mean, what's education? It's a service, like medicine or other things. And we provide it. And a competitive market tends to be a market that produces the best mix outcomes. We know that from, you know, all the principles of competition policy. But in education, you got a monopoly service provider, and monopoly providers tend to focus more on the needs of the provider than the customer. And that's a big set of issues, I believe, in public education.
Well, and you've done some of that by saying to principals, I'll let you actually set your agenda, but you're also now accountable.
Absolutely. Well, as I say, if you don't have market-based accountability, you need a robust accountability system. And the mayor and I, from day one, started talking about this and creating metrics to measure progress in schools. So it's a little ridiculous to compare a school in an affluent neighborhood with a school in a high-poverty neighborhood, because demographics affect outcomes. But if you compare lots of schools with similar demographics, so we in New York we have 1,600 schools. Then you can look at the progress they're making and compare apples to apples, and that's what we do in New York. And we put a letter grade on every school. Now that's our way to say accountability really matters. And sometimes, as a result of the letter grades, we'll close a school, we'll fire a principal, we'll give principals bonuses. Some teachers get bonuses. So we're trying to inculcate market principles and rational human resource principles into what was pretty much a lockstep pay, seniority, life tenure organization. So that's been a big piece of what we've done in New York, and I think working quite well. A long way to go, but working well.
Do you do time sequence sort of studies too? Because the same school over time, if you see improvements, that would be,
absolutely.
That would be another way.
That's exactly what we look at. We look at year-to-year improvements, and we measure it against similarly situated schools. So every school that gets its report card is in a cohort of another 39 or so schools. And so you're comparing their year-to-year progress. And let's just say, for simplistic sense, your school started as an average of 2.6 on a scale of 4, and mine started at 2.58. And if yours goes to 2.66 and mine goes to 2.54, that's big in terms of the impact. So you would be getting an A and I might be getting a C or a D or something like that. And we make all this transparent. It's a classic, give the consumer the information. So one of my favorite stories, a reporter, I won't say which paper, but she'd written a number of stories making fun of our accountability system, saying, well, it's artificial to put a letter grade and simplistic and reductionistic and all the other stuff. We gave you all the data behind it. In other words, it was all there. Every parent had it online and stuff like that. And so she'd written a few stories pointing out, which is true, some schools that are perceived as doing well don't in fact get a great grade. But in 1,600 schools, a handful of, if you will, outliers doesn't matter in any enormous sense, but people can have fun. But I was having breakfast with the same reporter, and I asked her kid is 3 years old. I said, where are you going to send him to school? And she said, I was going to send him to PSX, but they got a C on their report. So that's all I needed to hear. It's working. It's signaling is working.
But it sounds a lot like what we hear in our horizontal merger guidelines that you said you read today. So much for totally divorcing yourself from the antitrust bar, huh?
Well, I tell you, my wife's the general counsel of Sony, so I don't have the option to fully divorce myself. And I know the most exciting pillow talk is not about antitrust. But before we talked about that antitrust isn't sexy, in my house is very sexy.
Well, and the natural experiments that you see in there and the transparency policy. So
Absolutely.
Again, it's all good government to do some of this stuff. You're really in a very enviable position because you can speak your mind, not have to worry it's going to come back to you in a case or anything else down the road.
You're assuming I'll never practice law
well,
again.
Maybe, but
certainly
right
not in the
now.
short run.
But it's never really. You don't need an excuse of not being in private practice. You've always spoken your mind, which is one of the things I love about you.
Thank you.
So we've had people think that what we've seen the Supreme Court do over the last decade might be swinging too much toward defendants when you see Twombly and the other cases that are out there. What is your sense? Has the pendulum swung too far?
So, I don't follow this closely. It's obviously, in running a school system is a full-time job. My guess is it has swung a little too far. I worry about... America's gone through kind of 3-4 phases in the last 50, 60 years in antitrust enforcement. It was you're too young to remember, but the big is bad, right? The conglomerate merger, and whether it had market power or not, we would stop it just on the theory that we wanted to preserve our notion is a Brandeisian notion of small is beautiful. So I thought that was in the 60s, pretty aggressive period. And then we had the reaction set in, probably the paradigm that was Bill Baxter and the Reagan years and stuff like that. And I think that swung us too far. Then I think probably during the period when Ann and Bob Potofsky and I were running, I think we moved it, certainly not back to where we were in its heyday, in its biggest bad days, but really much more into a kind of market power focused analysis. But we weren't afraid to tackle market power, even under Section 2. Now I'm worried that we may be moving back toward, antitrust enforcement is largely about cartel enforcement. And that, I think, misses at least some of the issues, whether it was Microsoft, whether it was Visa MasterCard that we tackled, some of the mergers that we blocked, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Sprint, WorldCom, where I think there were serious market power issues, and market power can, I think, retard innovation, which I'm particularly concerned about in the 21st century. So for all those reasons, again, I don't want to pretend to be a scholar of the Supreme Court's antitrust jurisprudence, but I would be cautious about trying to move the paradigm. I thought, not surprising I thought this, but that, I had a pretty solid group of people around me who were, people like Doug Melamed who were cautious about it. They weren't, people who thought every merger is bad for America. And I thought we struck a reasonable balance. I thought most of the cases that we brought, and I think history vindicated this, where we, even with conservative courts. I mean, the D.C. Circuit in the Microsoft case, very conservative court. And I think I think we had it about right, and I would be afraid, any given case may not matter that much, but that we don't return antitrust enforcement to the way I think Ann found the department, which was largely a criminal cartel enforcement. Now, I'm all for criminal cartel enforcement, but I don't think that's the sole dimension of antitrust enforcement.
I think we're seeing that now. The Supreme Court, I guess, has been really more active recently on private enforcement, not so much the public enforcement when you see Twombly, all the pleadings requirements, and I'm defendant-oriented myself, and you hear people, though, saying maybe now with all those cases, they all went pretty quickly through summary judgment and for the defendants. And but at the same time, there's a cost to society in having courts have a backlog of cases that haven't been adequately pled. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens with American Needle, which is in for this session.
Has it been argued yet?
It's been argued.
And do people have a prediction?
I think you could talk to 3 people and get 5 opinions.
Yeah.
Isn't that the way it usually is?
That's the way. I mean, you put your finger on something that also always interested me. Well, there are 2 dimensions. I always used to joke about it, but I don't think it's a joke. America believes so much in competition policy that we have 2 enforcement agencies. That's one more than we need. And I've long advocated that we ought to have a single enforcement agency, particularly in a global economy where I think nation-to-nation relationships, the kind of thing we had with the European Commission, I think those things matter a lot. The other thing we have is 50 attorneys general, as well as a whole private plaintiff's bar.
Regulation as well.
As, individual So those things concern me. I mean, even as someone who's positioned as a pretty aggressive enforcer, I always worry about, whether each individual state can bring its action. We have a national economy competing in a global economy. And even Barney Frank raised with me when I was there the issues about whether every state ought to be an enforcer. And, of course, private enforcement has all sorts of mixed incentives. I mean, the attorney's fees dimension of that thing is a big. So I'm a big believer in robust national enforcement, careful but robust. I'm not a big believer in having 1,000 flowers bloom and run all around the place and create policy. And as I say, I've never been a believer. I think the grand concordat, which I try to propose, was we ought to merge the 2 agencies in the Justice Department and then have Bob Potofsky run it, because he was spectacular, and this way it looked like we each gave something to the cause here. And I see now, a decade after I've been out of the game, that we still have 2 enforcement agencies.
Same debate.
It's just, it proves what I've learned in education, is the status quo has lots of defenders.
It definitely does. And there's a discussion about competition of ideas and how perhaps you pick up something as a result, but then you have inefficiency, and that's where you're going. If you have limited resources, but then those same resources are chasing the exact same violation, that doesn't seem to necessarily be the right way to go.
Well, you have multiple levels, right? You have the level of inefficiency. You have the whole set of issues about assignment, who gets the case. I mean, clearly we don't have time for that. But the most important issue for me is you want a competition authority that speaks with one voice. Now, in practical terms, certainly when Bob and I were there, I mean, we were intellectually and personally very aligned. But I don't think it's really a good idea to have multiple voices, or to have people who are meeting with Europeans or Japanese or Korean enforcement agencies or competition authorities and basically can be taking somewhat inconsistent or different a position. I don't think it's right for the business community. I mean, people in the business community even now say to me, gosh, how do I make sure that one agency gets this right? I mean, you know this, right? So that can't be right. It shouldn't be which agency you go to makes it outcome determinative in terms of your future. And that was certainly, even when I was there, true. And I'm not a big fan of commission enforcement in general, not having nothing to do. Again, I think Bob Potofsky was as good an antitrust enforcer as anyone I'd ever met. But, you got 5 commissioners, and if people lobby the commissioners, I mean, come on. One of the wonderful things about the Justice Department, and having come from the Clinton White House, that I really loved about the Antitrust Division in the Justice Department was it really was exempt from politics when it came to enforcement. Not policy, but enforcement. And nobody, when I sued Microsoft Microsoft or Visa, Mastercard. I mean, these are big players. Nobody said a word. And so, you know, the idea that people would lobby, I mean, it's, you know, people come in and say to you, you know, you'd come in or your colleagues would come in, you'd make an argument. That's fine. But the idea that you call some senator who'd say, I mean, it's ridiculous. That's not the way you do competition policy.
You know, Bob Potofsky this week got the Sherman Award at the Justice Department. It was quite nice to see it. Justice Breyer, among others, made some remarks. It was a total love fest. It was wonderful.
If you don't love Bob Potofsky, there's something wrong with you, right?
That's exactly right.
He's an extraordinary man. I've been privileged to know him as a friend and as a colleague in enforcement. I taught at Georgetown Law School. And I was so sorry I couldn't make it. I mean, I used to love these Sherman Award events, and unfortunately, I had to be in New York that day. But you couldn't have picked a better person than Bob to have given the Sherman Award to.
So you look back at everything that you did in those 5 years, which was incredible. Something like 52 criminal convictions, 140 consents. You went and won against Microsoft, against the airlines, against Visa, MasterCard. If you could only pick one accomplishment that you thought was your greatest accomplishment, what would it be?
If it's a case, it would have to be Microsoft. If it was an accomplishment, it would have to be the fact that I returned the Antitrust Division to litigation.
Right. You really
I didn't like sort of consent decree enforcement. It always seemed to me to be tariffing transactions when you do a lot of consent. And I didn't think it would have a big impact. I used to say to our people all the time, look, if in fact this is something that you can fix with a little fix, it's something that you don't need to fix. And if it's something that requires a big fix, people are not going to give it to you in a consent decree. And when I got there, the whole Antitrust Division, just a little bit underhand, but it really was in a focus of we don't litigate big, tough cases. And I went so far as to bring in David Boies to litigate the Microsoft case because I didn't think we had the internal litigation talent and resources. But I think one of the real successes we had was we let the courts decide on the tough cases, and we weren't afraid. And I think that both led to the credibility of our work. So it wasn't like people, your clients, and you would get this in a nanosecond, right? You say, okay, look, we can stay here and fight with the division or something like that, or we can give him a nickel on $1 worth of transaction that they want to call a consent decree. And so that's just like paying a toll in order to get your deal done. I mean, it's like filing fees in some countries. Some countries in America, you have to pay, outside of America, you pay a filing fee. And they don't do any enforcement. They just take the fee and run an agency. I mean, it's like nuts. But that's the way a lot of consent decrees. So the thing I felt best about was that, and I remember staff, because changing cultures in an organization is hard, but I remember staff used to push back, say, well, we could lose it or stuff like that. And I used to take the position, if we're not losing litigated cases, then we're not doing our work. That, if all we're doing is basically playing a four-corner offense, sitting on the ball, taking the easy cases, I think that's a mistake. So I was proud of that. Go back to Microsoft for a second. One of the things I'm happiest about now, 10 years later, is that my greatest private financial backer in New York City has been Bill Gates. And I think it speaks volumes of Bill, because obviously that was an acrimonious lawsuit. There was a lot of personal feeling attached to it. We had taken on, at that point, I think, America's, in many people's eyes, greatest company, and there's no question Microsoft had done great things and had transformed the computing industry and made the desktop and laptop computers massively available throughout the country and the world. And at the time I took this job, Bill had just given $10 million to a project in New York City for education, and everybody was worried that that would be the end of it. And to Bill's great credit, he has come in and given us probably around $150 million over the 8 years I've been there. I've come to know him well. I've come to know his wife, Melinda, well. I got invited to the Bill Gates house when they did an event at the Gates Foundation, and my favorite story is I knocked on the door, and the person who answered the door looked at me and said, "Are you who I think you are?" And I said, "I suspect I am, sir." And he said, "Gee, I sure hope you brought a food taster with you tonight." And that's such a perfect story. But anyhow, life has curious twists and turns, and the Bill Gates-Joel Klein relationship has been one of those that I find most enjoyable.
It's because you're both professionals.
Well, I think it speaks volumes of Bill because
yes.
it was his money and he didn't have to do it. And I think, I hope he did it because he thought he was making an intelligent investment in school reform. And I've worked closely with him on school reform.
Well, you talk about interesting twists and turns. I thought I knew you very well before. You had this great history of public service. And then, which I don't view as being bad, but I was a little surprised when you left the Justice Department and you went to Bertelsmann, big business. And I was, since then we've seen that happen with others, Hugh Pate, Charles Janes, Debbie Majaris, but you were really and Anne had done that, but more as an independent. She went to a small CLEC. What was your thoughts?
It's an interesting question. I've thought a lot about it. Unlike some of the other people who've gone in become general counsel, I went to Bertelsmann to become a business person. And I guess there were two things that were going on simultaneously for me. One, I'd been deputy counsel to the president, run the Antitrust division, had an incredibly enjoyable legal career, but there was a feeling that I had kind of done it, and somehow I felt like I had another hill to climb in me that I wanted to climb. I was very interested in media and technology, which I had done a lot of work on at the Justice Department, and all these things around Bertelsmann with Napster and with, what's now become Google, and the sort of movement from print media to online delivery and stuff, they all interested me. I was 55 when I left the department, 54, and when I left the department. And so I thought, this was a good time in my life personally to move on to something that I thought would be new, challenging, and different. And of course, at that time, I didn't think I would soon again be moving on to run the school system, but that happened.
Well, before we jump to that, because I do want to hear that part of the story too. So you brought with you running a fairly large department of the Justice Department. It's the divisions, how many lawyers and staff?
Probably 400 or 500 lawyers and 1,000 people. But I mean,
Which
small I mean, big for a lawyer to run. And, as you know from your own firm, lawyers don't manage things. So, I mean, you have somebody called a managing partner, but that's a euphemism in a law firm. Justice Department, I think we did try to manage, but not like, for example, you'd manage a company like Bertelsmann or even a school system like New York.
So do you think you ran a law firm at one point. You're one of the founding partners of a law firm, then you run the division. Do you think those skills and your lawyering skills helped you when you were at Bertelsmann?
So I think they did. I think managing organizations helps because both, as you say, I founded on a Klein and Farr, and then I ran the division. And I think, particularly with the division, I thought about, what are we trying to accomplish? What's the vision? So when I talked about this litigation, I have no doubt that was the biggest change to move us from a settlement organization to a litigating organization. And that's a management challenge because you get all the lawyers. I remember people used to say to me, the staff wants to sit on the cases when they're interesting because they're afraid they'll come to the front office and say, don't do anything. And it's, of course, time is money. And your clients legitimately, if there's something to happen, make it happen. If there's nothing going to happen, life is too short for 18-month, 24-month investigation. I mean, it's nuts. So in any case, I think those management skills helped me, but I learned a lot at Bertelsmann, and both in terms of the differences between for-profit and government organizations and law firms in the traditional sense. The other thing that I think helped me a lot was the White House counsel's office, because there wasn't a management issue, but was the intense scrutiny of the media, which you don't get even at the Antitrust division, certainly in the private practice of law. And that, the ability to have to make decisions and realize, they're going to be reported on the next day, so you can't take them back. When you're thinking about with a client, should we settle it? You can say, oh, well, let's think about it overnight. We'll go. But when somebody says, well, what are you going to do about this crisis or this problem?
Exactly.
Or, and that's a skill that I found enormously helpful in trying to both play the leadership role I was assigned at Bertelsmann and certainly running a school system.
Crisis management skills.
Crisis management, making decisions.
Right.
recognizing you're going to make some that you wish you hadn't made,
Right, exactly.
and then you undo them if it makes sense. But it's doing it in the glare of a microscope when people are, mostly what the media would like to report about is how somebody screwed something up.
Right.
And that's perfectly understandable. That's what their fourth estate role is. So that was something that I had very little exposure to, certainly in private practice, and that all changed in the Clinton White House, where we had, issues like Whitewater and the Treasury and some of the, very intense political and other issues that we had to deal with, a couple of Supreme Court justices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So when you see all the pieces go together, it looks like you spent your entire life really training to become the chancellor of the schools. When you look at, it was a very gutsy move when you were at Harvard Law School and you left to go basically teach. People would say, what were you doing, Joe? Similarly, leaving a private practice like you did and going off to work at the White House and then Justice Department, going to Bertelsmann. How did it happen that you got the job?
So first of all, I think what you said is absolutely brilliant, that you said I look like I trained all my life. I've said that, and you've
Really?
never heard me say it.
No.
I feel like this is a job I've trained for all of my life, and the ways you've described and in other ways. And the reason that I feel that way is because I believe for my life personally, education changed my entire life. I grew up in public housing in a
Right.
family where nobody had gone to college, or, it was just, education was something that we talked about but was not a part of our family's history or background. And to go on to do the things that I've done has convinced me that that's a game changer in people's lives, and in my view, the magic ingredient in America's sauce. The key to the American dream, and something we've done brilliantly, is to be able to provide poor kids an opportunity to reach for the stars. And education is going to be the medium by which you get there. So I worry about whether we're still doing that. I worry about the American dream in the 21st century, and I really believe, and I've said this, and even 8 years into it I'd say it, I believe we're massively undereducating kids for the challenges in the 21st century. So this is, to me, the greatest domestic challenge we face. If you assume we can navigate the shoals and perils of global security, and the country remains secure in a war-peace sense, then I think the greatest challenge is not our economy or these other issues, is really the massive undereducation of our kids. And so I felt both in a personal level and in a philosophical level this was a space for me. And it all came together, and there's always a certain amount of serendipity to these things. Mike Bloomberg, who I knew, didn't know well, but I knew him, and when I moved to New York and was with Bertelsmann, I saw him socially every now and again. I'd known him down here. So he wanted to get control of the schools. We used to have a school board. And he said, that's dysfunctional. You have people playing politics. The mayor is not aligned with the board. You fight over money. So he went to Albany and got control of the schools. And he and I have some mutual friends, and I think they had told him about my interest in and passion for public education. And I think, he asked me, talked to me, and I never thought I'd get the job, so I didn't worry about it too much. I figured I was making a lot of money at Bertelsmann. I was okay with that. So he started talking to me, and then, he kind of, I think, decided that somebody with a fresh eye from outside, the interstices of the education establishment is what he wanted, and somebody who really, in a weird sense, didn't depend on the job. I always knew, whether it was going back to Bertelsmann or whether it was going back to practice law, whether it was to teach at a university, I had lots of options. And I think that enables, and I think the mayor knew that we were going to need somebody to take on some pretty tough fights. The status quo, as we said before, has a lot of very, very enthusiastic defenders. And if you're not willing to really challenge the status quo, you won't change it. And so I think the mayor thought I had both the independence, the commitment, and the managerial and the other background skills that would enable me to drive reform. And I always joke that when he introduced me, the first day after he appointed me, he introduced me and he said I would make the tough and sometimes controversial decisions. And I always joke now, 8 years later, whenever I see him, he says, remember I said tough and sometimes, not always controversial decisions, because I have become quite controversial. But I think in the transformation of an education system that is fundamentally focused on the needs of the adults to one that's focused on the needs of the kids, that's one that's going to require a lot of China to be broken.
Exactly.
And that's why I think in many ways my background and, as you said, training for this job, or in some respects, to put it in a more pointed language, training for this fight is something I've done throughout my adult life.
You can't cause change to occur without that, can you?
I don't think so.
No.
I always joke, as charming as I am, when I say to people we ought to have an entirely different pay scale, that we ought to not have tenure for people, that we ought to have annual review, and we ought to base salaries on merit, stuff like that. Those are things that, understandably, people who are in the system and are living under a different set of rules they probably find more congenial, are not going to be enthusiastic about our changing them. So that creates its own challenge. But my own view of leadership, and the mayor says it best, he says, when you lead from the front. So you don't want, in other words, you get out there. Sure, you're going to take some hits, but you get out there and you try to create the consensus, and you articulate the vision, and you acknowledge the problem. And then over time, the system begins to move. I remember there's this great cartoon of Gandhi, sort of, he's running down the street, and somebody said, "Where are you going?" And he says, "Those are my people. I'm their leader. I'm trying to catch up to them." And that's so much of what my image of so much of leadership is: people with their finger to the wind to figure it out. But I think going in with a strong vision, trying to figure out what are the levers that'll change it, willingness to take on the controversy, the heat. My friend Michelle Rhee here in D.C. is doing precisely that, and I think doing a masterful job. And then people say to me, "Well, why is she so controversial?" And I say, "Well, let me tell you this. When she stops being controversial, I'm going to call Mayor Fenty and tell him to get another chancellor."
Right, exactly.
Because I think otherwise it won't change.
When you left the Justice Department, I remember reading in the Washington Post, people said you had a halo on your head that most lawyers would dream of. I think one of the reasons you get that halo on your head is you weren't afraid to take on the controversy. And when you are done one day being chancellor and sitting back in your chair, I think you'll have a record you'll be very proud of. I'm waiting to see what you achieve next in the job, being a New York City person myself. My kids are out of the school system, but I enjoy reading it. Tonight, I don't want to give away everything you're going to say, but you're going to be our speaker at the spring meeting dinner. What are you going to hit on as being some of the high points?
I think some of the points we've talked about, but what I really want to focus on, I think in America, through the third quarter of the last century, I think we had done a lot of really good things in education. First country to insist on secondary high school education for everyone. After the war, really dramatically increased college education. And I think starting in about 1980, going through the current time, I think we've really fallen back. And I'm very concerned about that in the current competitive environment, because while we're not moving at the pace we used to move at, the rest of the world is moving aggressively. And in a global economy, people will be able to get what they need elsewhere. So if you talk to the big multinational corporations, IBM and so forth, IBM is going to find the best engineers for the best price wherever they can find them. And if those people are not in America, that's going to have a big impact on our economy. So while I always used to think the one flaw in American education was the massive inequality sort of embodied in notions like separate but equal, now I worry about that the overall system is not going to produce the economic results that we need to keep us competitively viable in the 21st century. When I see a simple example, kids in Korea go to school 235 days a year. Our kids go 180. Hello?
Right.
I mean, why is that a winning hand? So that kind of thing, and then you got all the racial and the ethnic achievement gaps on top of that. I think we don't view ourselves as in a very intense global financial economic competition, but I think we are. And probably the most important book I've read in recent years is a book by two Harvard economists, and my antitrust friends will find it good that I'm still reading economic books, but by a woman named Claudia Golden and Lawrence Katz, called The Race Between Education and Technology. And they point out that through 1975, 1980, America's educational attainment kept pace with our technological advancement. And they show the year-to-year growth and how much we improved, what our college rates were, number of years in school, et cetera, and parallel that with the growing technological advancement of our country as we move from an agrarian into a manufacturing, into a post-manufacturing economy. In the last 25, 30 years, the gap is constantly widening, and that has led to greater and greater income inequality and a greater division between the wealthiest and the have-nots. Exactly. And that's a big concern. So I'm going to talk about those things and then talk about some of the solutions.
That's perfect. It's very appropriate that you're sitting, you might not realize, behind you is Abraham Lincoln. You might not quite be Abraham Lincoln, but to me, you definitely have been one of my heroes throughout the years, and I really appreciate you coming. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's so kind.